This gospel passage that we just heard from John's gospel is one that we read every single year on Reformation Sunday. And I think that's actually very appropriate that we hear this once a year. And I think it's a very appropriate selection for Reformation Sunday. Because in that reading, you might have heard, Jesus says, if the Son will make you free, you will be free indeed. And the Jews say, who are listening to him, what are you talking about? We've never been slaves to anyone. And what we need to know, the astute reader will remember that the Jews, in fact, have been enslaved multiple times throughout their people's history. They were slaves in Egypt, the Babylonians came and exiled them, the Assyrians came and exiled them, and at that very moment, when these Jews are having a conversation with Jesus, the Jews were living in occupied territory. They weren't quite enslaved to the Romans, but the Romans certainly were not allowing them to be fully free. And so I think this is a great reading for Reformation Sunday because we get this picture of a group of people who have forgotten their history. They've forgotten who they are and what they've been through. And so on this day, when we remember the great history that we come from, it's a very important reminder that history does matter. So a little bit about the Reformation for all of you. The Reformation is often celebrated on the last Sunday in October in many different Protestant denominations, although we as Lutherans tend to be really excited about this day and maybe do it up a little bit more than others. And it's because, like I said, most scholars will say the Protestant Reformation really started on October 31st, 1517, when an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church. And that was the matchstick that started off this great Reformation where there were many, many other reformers there. And so as I think about this great history that we come from and try and think, what from the Reformation do we want to pull forward for today? What's the piece that really sticks with us that we need to continue to remember here in 2021? And Pastor Gary, I'd say that the thing that Martin Luther did so well is he talked about God's grace. And God's grace being such an important piece for reforming the church, reforming our lives, giving us a way forward.
Yeah, I would say he did that, but to be honest, I think what gets lost in that is the importance of works. That Luther didn't say they weren't important anymore. In fact, I think that sometimes we make Reformation so much about grace that we forget the importance of works and how much that's a part of the whole Reformation experience. So I know that everybody expects us to talk about grace on Reformation, but I'd like to talk about works for a little bit.
Well, and I think this is a good example, too, of another piece that the Reformation brought to us, and it's disagreement and debate, isn't it? Yes, because I really do think it's grace, and you think it's works. And yeah, all of the Reformation did have this piece of debate and argument helping reform and carry the church forward. So let's do that today. Why not? As lead pastor, I'll let you go first. Take the lead, sir. Why is it works? Because I totally disagree.
Works are so tangible. I mean, I know that I've worked. It's one of those things that is noticeable, not just in myself, but you can see it too. It's also controllable. I get to decide what I do and when I do it. So I have that opportunity in works to feel like it's an experience that I can put myself into. And if we take that out of ourselves, we lose the way that we find ourselves actually working for God. And I think that's really important for us to lift up at times.
And it's funny, as I listen to you say all that, I don't disagree, but I also feel like it gives even more credence to my idea of grace, because there are these moments in life that we can't explain, that we can't hold on to or point to. There's these moments when all of our work comes up short, and we're left wondering, how am I possibly going to continue moving forward? There's nothing I can do here, and that's the point of grace, is that God can cover up our mistakes, our shortcomings, that there's always a path forward with God's grace, simply because God is God and we are not. I've said that before. But I think that that's really important.
And maybe it is, but the other part is to understand how important it is to know that we can still do things. That's why we were given the law. The law becomes so important because when we find out that we're not,
Oops, I just realized that. Sorry for those of you on the live stream. The first first thing I said was really good. Go back and it's all about that we're talking about works instead of...
And works are important, like
and
turning
works are
on your mic.
important, like turning on your mic. You see, that's the idea. When you don't have that experience, people have no idea what you're talking about. So they want to see it from you and hear it from you. And that's what the law does, is it gets us back to know what should we be doing. In fact, even Jesus, when he came and talked to us about the law, he did not say that we come to abolish the law, instead to fulfill it, that nothing from the law should disappear. And so when I insert myself in that, you know I'm actually trying to follow what God has established for my life to follow.
Okay, so Jesus did say he came to fulfill the law, but I also just hear that as what Jesus does for us, because we can't live up to the law. We can't work our way to God's expectation and hope for us. Only grace is what can take us there. And so if you're going to use a biblical example, I'm going to use one too. I think about when Jesus encountered the woman at the well. And here was a woman who, by the law, was completely condemned. And in fact, people were there ready to stone her. And Jesus...
Well, you mean probably the woman caught in adultery.
The woman caught in adultery.
Yes,
Sorry, yeah, not
okay.
the woman... Thank you, very good. Yeah, this is why dialogue's important. But so that woman, everything was set up against her, and yet Jesus provided a different way forward. Right? Jesus is the one who fulfills the law so that then we don't have to. And now I see what you're saying, and we've learned this morning why works are important. You have to turn your mic on. But in the same sense, we can't get anywhere without grace. Because under the law, as we heard in that Romans passage, we'll all be condemned. Under the law, we've got no way forward. But what we hear Jesus say is that if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed.
So I think the challenge that happens with works is that we connect it so much into the law that we feel enslaved to the works themselves. Because there was something where Paul talked about being enslaved to sin, because it's sin that reveals the law to us. So the challenge that works provide is that we can feel that they become the end all, and that we know that as much as you work, you can always find something else you could have done, or probably what we would put in our own minds, something else we should have done. And so the challenge with works is not that works are bad, it's that we enslave ourselves to the works rather than just immerse ourselves in the joy of the works.
And I'm remembering, you're starting to convince me to some degree here. I'm remembering a quote. It wouldn't be a Reformation sermon without a quote from Martin Luther. Martin Luther once said, "God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does." And so clearly, works has a place in all of this. And as I'm thinking about it, I see that you do need the good works, because if we just expect God's grace to constantly pick us up and cover over everything, well, then we could get really lazy as a result. And there's actually a lot of good writing out there about this idea of cheap grace, about just expecting God to make everything better for us, and then never actually examining and seeing our own life transformed or reformed. And so for me, Gary, I think it's really about the order of operations. Do you remember this from elementary school math? Anyone or any math teachers out there? You have to do the math in the parentheses first before you multiply it, because if you multiply first, then it's all going to get messed up in the end. But it's the same way. You have to have grace first, and then the good works follow that. Because if we make it about our good works earning God's grace, well, then we're always going to end up in despair. We can't possibly work our way up to God. God always comes down to be with us, to forgive us, to love us, to pick us up again. And so the grace is what follows. Once we know that we're forgiven and that we're loved and that God is there for us no matter what, that sets us free. We're free indeed to then go and serve our neighbor in love. The way I like to talk about it is that good works is what salvation looks like. Let me say that again. Good works is what salvation looks like. If we've been saved by God's grace, then that will have a transforming effect on who we are and how we live each and every day. If we really understand the freely given love of God, well, then we can't help but live that out through good works in tangible ways, serving our neighbor. You want to see what salvation looks like? come to the meal packing later. There you will see people responding to God's grace by serving their neighbor.
So if I go serve my neighbor, I would have to say what I would think is a whole ton of leaves have come down, right, the last couple of weeks. So I could go to my neighbor's house, unbeknownst to them, and rake up their yard for them, because I know that they might not have the capabilities doing of that themselves. But what I might think is when I get done, you know what it's like to see a lawn filled with leaves, and you rake them all up and you pack them up, and there's such satisfaction with seeing what you have done, right? It's what I've accomplished that seems to have filled me up with this sense of completeness. But then, as you talk, it reminds me that sometimes if I walk away from that task, I just feel different. I just feel that in me something has stirred, something that wasn't there before. And it's different from having a lawn filled with leaves and a lawn that now is clean. It's something that's just different in my spirit. And so maybe it was the avenue of grace in me that caused me to perform that work. And so what I start to think about is that grace becomes foundational and important to us, but what we do really matters. But maybe I have to realize that I cannot work my way into heaven. But somehow, by God's grace, heaven can work its way into me. Maybe that's the reform I need.
Maybe that's the reform that this has always been all about.
Amen.
Amen.
We join in singing our hymn of the day. It's printed on page 9.